January 28th, 1945, still 100 days before war's end. The last Wehrmacht contingent, sworn to the so-called final battle. Amateur recordings of German soldiers in the Baltic Kurland at the Baltic Sea. They can only delay the downfall, not prevent it. More German soldiers have died in the last 100 days than in the entire first half of the war. Supported by 3,800 tanks, 1.5 million Red Army soldiers overrun the Wehrmacht's defense lines on January 28, 1945. Not only in the east, but also in the west, Allied troops have already advanced beyond the borders of Hitler's Reich. Their advance now seems inevitable. On this January 28th, a Sunday, 100 days before the end of the war, a young German writes to her husband, a soldier in the Luftwaffe.
The worst is just sitting around and waiting for what the future will bring. You know, if I were a man, I'd fight for as long as I could. Fred, don't say we could possibly be overrun by the Russians.
The war has long been lost for the Wehrmacht. The Nazi regime, however, continues relying on slogans of perseverance. A newsreel screened in German cinemas transforms the hopeless defensive combat into the heroic resistance of German soldiers.
The first images from the battles in the east. Constant fire from all German units is causing enormous losses to the Bolshevik divisions.
As a last resort, Nazi propaganda presents old men of the so-called Volkssturm. They are now to defend the homeland, just as the Prussians once fought against Napoleon's superiority. Underlined by Kohlberg, the Nazi era's most costly film opens in the cinemas.
Keine Freude ist süßer als die Freude der Freiheit. Aber ihr wisst, was uns blüht, wenn wir diesen Kampf nicht ehrenvoll gewinnen. Darum, welche Opfer von dem Einzelnen auch gefordert werden mögen, sie wiegen die heiligen Güter nicht auf, für die wir kämpfen und siegen müssen.
Slogans of perseverance, likewise, for the home front.
Nesselbeck, wie lange glauben Sie, halten wir das noch aus?
Wenn es sein muss, noch eine ganze Weile, Herr Kommandant. Die Häuser können uns verbrennen, unsere Erde nicht. Und wenn wir nicht als Menschen leben können, dann leben wir immer als Maulwürfe.
The film's a flop. The Germans prefer to watch something entertaining to help them forget the terrible reality for a few hours. The Volkssturm proves ineffectual for deployment in war. Especially the military veterans and hastily recruited civilians realize the futility. Many prefer to save their own lives. But for most, there is no escape, from the field police or from Soviet captivity. In Lower Silesia, the Red Army advances into Reich territory. There is little resistance. A Soviet soldier writes in his journal,
"Our tanks crushed everything in their path. Their tracks flattened carts, horses, and everything else in the road."
The results are tangible. A mood report from the Wehrmacht.
Understandably, reports from the refugees are depressing. Yet some of them, despite their experiences, express confidence that the Führer will soon return them to their homes.
As they advance, the Red Army is angry to see that many Germans are still living in prosperity. Many seek revenge. A Red Army soldier writes,
Rightly, the Germans are running from us as from the plague. Our people invaded their homes like a pack of Huns.
West of Krakow, a Soviet vanguard discovers a campsite with hundreds of barracks, Auschwitz-Birkenau. On January 28, 1945, a hastily summoned camera team shoots the first footage of the death camp. They come across 6,000 surviving inmates. Too weak for transport, they had been left to die. Tuesday, 30th of January 1945, still 98 days before war's end. For a long time, the party leadership has banned all evacuation. Yet faced with the Soviet advance in the east, it cannot be halted. On January 30th, about 4 million Germans are estimated to be on the run. 2 weeks later, that number will rise to 7 million. Most of the refugees are flocking to the Baltic Sea coast near Danzig or Gdansk, hoping to take ship to the west. The newsreels are intended to be reassuring. They convey an orderly rescue. But the ships are often overloaded with refugees, as is the Wilhelm Gustloff in Gdynia, near Danzig. The former cruise ship departs at noon on 30th January, with about 10,000 people on board. In Berlin, a team of radio technicians arrives in the Reich Chancellery. On the 12th anniversary of his rise to power, Adolf Hitler is to speak on the radio. The aura of the Führer still holds the ailing Reich together.
Es ist unser unabänderlicher Wille, in diesem Kampf der Errettung unseres Volkes vor dem grauenhaftesten Schicksal aller Zeiten vor nichts zurückzuschrecken und unwandelbar und treu dem Gebot der Erhaltung unserer Nation zu gehorchen.
Words that many still trust. That day, a German soldier writes to his wife.
My darling Inge, at 10 p.m. the Führer will speak. I am consumed with joy, and tears fill my eyes in gratitude that we have our Führer, who raises us so high above all.
This is the last time the Germans will hear Hitler's voice.
Es gibt deshalb in diesem Schicksalskampf für uns nur ein Gebot. Wer ihren abkämpft, kann damit das Leben für sich und seine Lieben retten. Wer der Nation aber feig oder charakterlos in den Rücken fällt, wird unter allen Umständen eines schimpflichen Todes sterben.
Some still cling desperately to their faith.
As ever, it was wonderful to hear the Führer's voice. How heavy must be his burden. Seen thus, it is almost painful to hear the Führer's words, hoping for a decision. But one has, in fact, been taken.
Those aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff also hear Hitler's speech on the radio.
Wer ihren abkämpft, kann damit das Leben für sich.
A Soviet submarine approaches the Gustloff from the coastal side and fires 3 torpedoes. The ship lists immediately. Water rushes in, as one survivor later recalls.
People clung together. Everything was sliding and there was terrible screaming. Stern up, the Gustloff then sank into the Baltic Sea. A horrific sight for the survivors floating on the water, on rafts and in boats.
It is over 2 weeks later before a military newspaper reports.
Refugee ship sinks within 15 minutes, 7,000 drown. Corpses were washed up on the coast of Danzig Bay.
In fact, there are over 9,000 dead. February 3rd, 1945, still 94 days before war's end. The former anti-aircraft tower at the Humboldt-Hain in Berlin, During the bombardment, the reinforced concrete giant is to protect the capital from air raids. 12.8 centimeter twin guns are aimed at Allied aircraft. On the morning of February 3rd, US B-17 bombers are readied for takeoff in the southeast of England. About 1,000 planes taxi over the runway as part of Operation Thunderclap. Never before has the Allied Bomber Command sent such a huge force to Berlin in broad daylight, directly into the nerve center of the Third Reich. At 2 minutes past 11, the first aircraft dropped their deadly loads. Within 51 minutes, the US Air Force drops over 2,000 tons of bombs on the center of Berlin, largely unhindered by German air defense. Entire districts are reduced to rubble. About 3,000 people are killed on this 3rd February. Among them, Roland Freisler, the dreaded blood judge and president of the so-called People's Court. The day before, he passed 4 death sentences. On February 3rd, 1945, Freisler is hit by a piece of shrapnel outside the criminal court, attempting to reach the air raid shelter. The heaviest attack on the inner cities so far leaves thousands of residents of the central districts, Mitte, Tiergarten, Kreuzberg and Wedding, homeless. A report for the Wehrmacht states,
The mood of the Berliners is solemn and despondent. They want to keep the faith and hope for a good end to the war, but can no longer find much cause for hope.
The Reich Chancellery is also badly damaged in the bombing. With his entourage, the dictator escapes into the bunker built especially for him. There, as almost every evening, he gazes wistfully at the model of the art city of Linz, his place of refuge. The tranquil city on the Danube where Hitler plans to retire after the war. This plan has now been laid to rest. Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill lands in the Crimea. At Yalta, he is to meet with US President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin to discuss the future. At the summit, the Big Three agree that the war must be ended quickly. But the future division of power in Europe is still unclear. Too different are the self-interests of the three leaders, and there is a great deal of mutual mistrust. Tuesday, February 13th, 1945, still 84 days before war's end. The people of Dresden are looking forward to a little diversion on this Shrove Tuesday. The Baroque capital on the Elbe has thus far been spared from the air raids, but at this time it is overcrowded with refugees. Meanwhile, there's an uproar in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. At the Situation meeting, Hitler's army command demands consequences. The warlord had mustered the Heeresgruppe Weichsel, or Vistula Army Group, to thwart a Soviet attack on Berlin. Commander-in-Chief Heinrich Himmler seems completely overwhelmed.
A blind man trying to describe colors.
As a staff officer puts it. At the insistence of Hitler's generals, Himmler now has an experienced army commander at his side and is later recalled for incompetence. The evening of February 13th at 9:45, the air raid siren resonates through Dresden. 800 British bombers are en route to the Elbe River. On board, almost 1,000 tons of high explosives and incendiary bombs. This time, there are no targeted strikes. Within 15 minutes, the inner city is in flames. The attack is carried out in several waves. The US Air Force also joins in. Dresden is bombed for 2 solid days. The historic inner city is almost completely destroyed. The fire is so powerful, it even melts glass. The firestorm leaves only the charred remains of its many victims. An internal report 4 weeks later puts
The number of bodies recovered at 18,375, and the total number of casualties is estimated at about 25,000.
Nazi propaganda announces a much higher number to the press in neutral countries. A Swedish newspaper promptly reports
Up to 200,000 victims in the air raid on Dresden.
in the summer of 1945, an amateur filmmaker is shooting in the ruins of the city. The extent of the devastation is horrendous, but the aerial warfare continues. Saturday, March 3rd, 1945, still 66 days before war's end. Beyond the Oder, the last Wehrmacht contingent is awaiting the Red Army's imminent offensive. On this third march, Hitler ventures out of the capital once again to visit the troops. The commander-in-chief no longer has reason to fear resistance from the Wehrmacht. His generals dutifully follow him into disaster. Untroubled, the warlord leaves the barracks outside Neuhardenberg with his retinue to return to the Reichschancellery in Berlin. He will not leave it alive. The cities of Königsberg, Breslau and Poznan had been declared fortresses and were fiercely contested. This footage from Poznan shows a city that has been hit by massive artillery fire for weeks. Soviet soldiers advance street by street and drive the Germans from their positions in bloody door-to-door combat. In West Germany, the so-called Siegfried Line near Aachen, with its concrete dragon teeth, has secured the border of the Reich since pre-war times. On March 3rd, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill sets foot on German soil for the first time since the beginning of the war. A symbolic visit, as Nazi propaganda has always depicted the Westwall as an indomitable bulwark. Allied troops are advancing further towards the Rhine. To hinder their advance, the Germans have mined their lines of defense at Düren and Jülich. But the US Air Force bombs the way clear with massive airstrikes. Only ruins remain of the city of Jülich. Nevertheless, the Allied troops only advance with heavy losses. An American camera team is on site in Jülich on March 3rd to document the visit of the Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Force. US General Dwight D. Eisenhower fears that the murderous war could last until 1946. Tuesday, March 6, 1945, still 63 days before war's end. This morning is the last day under the swastika for the cathedral city of Cologne. The 104th US Infantry Division has already fought its way to the edge of the inner city. Most of the civilian population has been evacuated. But German soldiers are still entrenched in the houses, ready for battle. Their number is unclear. There's risk of huge losses. The US troops are consequently nervous and fire at anything that moves. Using Cologne as an example, the Western Allies demonstrate that nobody can stop them. Some civilians, too, are caught between the fronts. At 5 p.m., the defenders surrender. Propaganda Minister Goebbels is outraged.
That Cologne capitulated in an hour is downright shameful.
Thursday, March 8th, 1945, still 61 days before war's end. On this day, high-ranking visitors from the capital arrive at the Oder. Propaganda Minister Goebbels wants to see the situation for himself. In his journal, he writes,
"The officers who accompany me report on the enemy's fighting morale. It is not particularly high. They always claim that if you push him hard, he's bound to run soon."
The propaganda effectively uses all means to stoke fear of the Soviet troops.
In these places retaken by German troops, every house is marked by the cruelties of the Bolshevik Soldateska. The bestialities are too monstrous to show all that the camera captured.
Even the slightest victory of the Wehrmacht is exploited by the Nazi propaganda. The Silesian town of Lauban has been retaken. Goebbels congratulates the fighters, including 16-year-old Wilhelm Hübner. Remains of a railway bridge. Still a reminder of the Allies' decisive breakthrough on the Western Front. The bridge at Remagen, 50 kilometers south of Cologne, the only Rhine crossing that the Wehrmacht couldn't demolish. A bottleneck allowing some 8,000 US troops to reach the right bank of the river within 24 hours. Hitler's pathetic invocation to defend Germany's iconic river is thus quashed. When he learns that the bridge is taken, he has those responsible shot for cowardice. From the mood report of the Wehrmacht.
The fall of Remagen was much discussed and linked to sabotage. The opinion among the broader population was that it's like the First World War in reverse. The homeland was being held under harsh conditions, while the front line was weakening.
West of the Rhine, the US troops are mostly given a warm welcome. As here in Meschenich, a small community in the Eifel region, people obediently follow the orders of the victors. Many are no longer prepared to sacrifice themselves for Führer, folk and fatherland, so soon before the end. In some places, soldiers still determined to fight are even berated as war prolongers. The Nazi propaganda now show footage from Berlin, where people are erecting barricades. The Wehrmacht is recording the overall mood.
It is hard to believe in a good end to the war. On the other hand, one could not completely give up hope. The best thing was not to think and speculate, but do one's duty and wait and see what happens.
On the same day, Stalin summons his chief of staff, Georgy Zhukov, to Moscow. Fearing a rapid Allied advance in the west, the Soviet dictator orders Zhukov to immediately draw up plans for the Battle of Berlin. In the theater of Görlitz, on this 8th March, 61 days before the surrender, Joseph Goebbels stages his last grand performance.
So wie der Führer die Krisen der Vergangenheit bewältigt hat, so wird diese bewältigen. Ist fest davon überzeugt. Noch vorgestern sagte mir, ich glaube so fest daran, dass wir eines Tages den Sieg an unserer Fahnen heften werden, wie ich je in meinem Leben an etwas fest geglaubt habe.
The propaganda minister is in top form and far from any reality.
Offensiven antreten werden in diesen Kampf hineingehen wie in einen Gottesdienst und ein Schrei der Rache wird aus ihren Kehlen emporsteigen, vor dem der Feind erblassen wird.
When footage from Görlitz and Lauban is shown in one of the last newsreels, however, the audience reaction is somewhat other than expected.
Certain movie theaters are now showing the newsreel of Reich Minister Dr. Goebbels speaking after the liberation of Lauban. His talk of the coming offensive, which is to liberate the occupied territories within days or weeks, is met with laughter and derision.
Tuesday, March 20th, 1945. Still 49 days before war's end. In the afternoon, in the garden of the Berlin Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler makes his final appearance for the Nazi propaganda. The scenes are shown a few days later in the German weekly newsreel. After the dictator has disappeared, the youngsters are introduced.
My mission was to bring reports to the individual company command posts. Added to that, I often brought bazookas and rations to the main battle line.
Alfred Tschesch, German youngster in the Hitler Youth, is hailed in the official Nazi paper Völkische Beobachter as a role model for the battling youth in the struggle to be or not to be, a lad of 12. It seems that Hitler himself has long since known that the war is lost. His resolve for total destruction is revealed in the so-called Nero Decree, which he issued the day before.
All military traffic, communications, industrial and supply facilities, as well as all material assets within the Reich, which the enemy can somehow use to continue his fight immediately or in the foreseeable future, are to be destroyed.
Hitler's Nero Decree is, above all, a blow to his own people. The Allies can hardly be stopped by burning fields and woodlands. Even among the Supreme Leader's close circle, there is criticism. Armaments Minister Albert Speer intervenes against the order for self-destruction. Later, Speer will maintain that Hitler explained that the German people had proved themselves inferior to the stronger people of the East. Speer is nevertheless able to convince the dictator to mitigate his Nero Decree. Friday, March 23rd, still 46 days before war's end. Nierstein on the Rhine, from where the Americans are planning to cross the river at nightfall. But on his own authority, US General George S. Patton brings the operation forward by 24 hours. Thus, on the morning of March 23rd, everything is decided in Nierstein. Supplies roll through the city. US camera teams document the historical event, the largest amphibious landing operation since D-Day. The few German soldiers on the eastern bank of the Rhine had surrendered without resistance. With his advance maneuver, General Patton steals the show from the British Allies, who had prepared their part of the operation 250 kilometers downstream. But the eccentric Star General is horrified by long-planned offensives, believing that every chance must be used to take the enemy by surprise. The next day, Patton crosses the Rhine in a jeep. He stops in the middle of the pontoon bridge and pisses into Germany's iconic river. Succinctly in his notes, he wrote,
"I took a piss in the Rhine."
To American reporters, he says,
"I've waited a long time for this. I deliberately didn't piss this morning so that I had a full load."
Sunday, April 1st, 1945, still 37 days before war's end. In Cologne and the rest of the Rhineland, cameramen are targeting the German populace. The faces of the defeated speak of effort, fear, and skepticism. A young woman writes in her diary,
This time we are to be thoroughly exorcised from militarism and National Socialism. Not one iota of what our world has been until now is permitted to stand.
The relationship between the British and Americans is tense. General Eisenhower plans to direct the US Army primarily towards central and southern Germany. He fears that Hitler's regime plans to concentrate all defenses there in an Alpine fortress. Winston Churchill is appalled. He is not prepared to leave sovereignty over Berlin and thus over Central and Eastern Europe to the Soviets without a fight. British Field Marshal Montgomery is to lead the Allied advance towards the German capital. What Churchill does not know, Eisenhower has already notified Stalin by telegram that the conquest of Berlin will be entrusted to the Red Army. The British are forced to give in. On this April 1st, the War Cabinet reluctantly approves Eisenhower's plan, thus sparing the Western Allies from the heavy losses involved in the urban battle for Berlin. Meanwhile, the siege ring around the Ruhr area is closed. The Allies stand before Münster. US troops have conquered Frankfurt am Main and are advancing towards the Harz Mountains and Thuringia. To quote a situation report of April 1st, 1945 by the Allied High Command, 37 days before the German surrender.
The enemy faces a situation in the West that is beyond his control. It is pointless to prolong operations. Hitler is defeated. However, like all other Napoleons, he will not leave without fighting to his last breath. It only remains to be seen how long this breath will last, or if the Germans are prepared to join in.
How many Germans are still loyal to their Führer? And will they continue to offer underground resistance, as the Nazi propaganda proclaims?
Hate is the prayer, revenge the war cry.
With this slogan on April 1st, 1945, for the first time, the radio station Wehrwolf appeals to the German people.
This is Werewolf Station speaking, the station of the German freedom movement in the enemy-occupied territories.
We werewolves will give everything for our people, and if we have nothing to give but our lives, then we will die for our people.
The message: no enemy is to feel safe on German soil. But the attacks of the Wehrwolves are mainly targeted at their own populace. Or, instead of offering resistance, many Germans in the occupied territories are counting on cooperation with the victors. Militarily, the Wehrwolf is a flop. Behind the notorious guerrilla troops are just 200 Hitler Youth members, who nonetheless spread terror and dread. Thus, one night, the mayor of a small town near Herford is shot dead on his own doorstep. Hitherto a loyal party member, he had refused to blow up a power station, but capitulated without a fight. Monday, April 9th, 1945. Still 29 days before war's end. The Flossenbürg concentration camp in northern Bavaria. Here in early April 1945, over 15,000 people are interned and used by the SS as slave labor. When US soldiers liberate the camp at the end of April 1945, they find only 1,500 survivors and many corpses. Most die of illness, starvation, and exhaustion shortly before their liberation. Executions take place until the end. On April 9th, 1945, US investigators discover that opponents of the regime were executed here by personal order of Hitler. Among them, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a spokesman for the persecuted Confessing Church, imprisoned for 2 years because of his contacts to the resistance. A witness later recalls,
I saw Pastor Bonhoeffer kneel in deep prayer with his Lord. The devotional and heartfelt nature of his prayer shook me to the core. Never before have I seen a man go to his death so piously.
After the execution, the SS sent an encrypted radio message to Berlin.
Mission accomplished as ordered. Confirmation not required.
Bonhoeffer's remains are burned in the crematorium. During these weeks, the leadership of the foundering empire falls into a final murderous frenzy. Hundreds of captured opponents of the regime die on the gallows or under the guillotine. In Hadamar, on the southern edge of the Westerwald region, stands a psychiatric clinic converted into an extermination institution by the Nazis. Only after the liberation do US investigators discover what they did here during the war. In the course of what was cynically called the euthanasia program, disabled patients were killed by gas, later by lethal injection or malnutrition. In a neighboring village on this 9th April, a young woman writes in her diary,
Today it was revealed that 26,000 people were killed in the insane asylum in Hadamar. Is this permissible in the eyes of God and the world? The blood of these poor, tormented souls screams to heaven for vengeance. And for this, you've all spent years out there on the front to fight and bleed for a delusion and for nothing. Poor betrayed youth.
On this April 9th, 29 days before the end of the war, the Red Army reaches Vienna. In Silesia and East Prussia, the battle for the already besieged cities of Breslau and Königsberg has been raging for days. In Königsberg, around 130,000 Germans have been boxed in since late January. Fierce street fighting rages, filmed by Soviet cameramen at close quarters. The Red Army suffers appalling losses. On April 9th, faced with a hopeless situation, Commander-in-Chief of the city, which had been declared a fortress, surrenders, whereupon Hitler has him condemned to death in absentia. 92,000 German soldiers go into captivity. They are taken away in line with the rules of martial law, contrary to what was predicted and happened elsewhere. The large Oderbruch River Valley is the Red Army's last obstacle on the way to Berlin. A German division has taken a stand 63 kilometers outside the capital. A cameraman films the last Wehrmacht contingent for a color newsreel that will never be screened. The defenders are still only dealing with Red Army reconnaissance planes. Even in the face of the impending storm, most people don't think of giving up. They see it as their duty to defend the German capital. An officer writes in his journal,
You can't surrender at the last minute, and then for the rest of your life regret that you didn't hold out.
Monday, April 16th, 1945, still 22 days before war's end. The Zielu Heights, 60 kilometers east of Berlin, where 120,000 defenders have been entrenched since mid-April. On this day, the Red Army attacks the German positions with 1 million soldiers. They make progress, but the assault is unsuccessful. The offensive is led by Marshal Georgy Zhukov. A directive from the political administration states,
No mercy. They have sown the wind, now they will reap the storm.
Despite superiority, it is 4 days before Zhukov's army takes the Zielu Heights. About 33,000 Soviet soldiers die in the battle. Their lives matter little for the Soviet command. Hitler also urges his soldiers to persevere.
For the last time, the Jewish Bolshevik mortal enemy and his masses have come to attack. They are trying to destroy Germany and exterminate our people.
At the same time, the Western world is mourning the loss of US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who died on April 12th at the age of 63. The US weekly newsreel shows pictures of the funeral.
In April, a great man was dead. The loss of Franklin Delano Roosevelt was deeply felt by people all around the world.
Hitler, on the other hand, rejoices in his last order of the day.
The moment that fate removed the greatest war criminal of all time from this earth, the turn of this war was decided.
Propaganda Minister Goebbels vainly fuels the illusion that the Allied alliance will now fall apart. North of Hanover lies the concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen. British soldiers liberate around 75,000 prisoners, most of them women and children. On this, April 16th, cameramen document the horror of the liberated camp. The commander is arrested on the spot. As a German woman writes to her husband,
"Oh, Fred, it's all so dreadful. I just can't understand how it came to this. Our dear, beautiful Germany. Is it true what they say we've done to the Jews?"
A British reporter ends his coverage of the camp with the words,
This day at Belsen was the most horrible in my entire life.
300 kilometers to the southeast, another camp is liberated, Buchenwald. More than 1,000 residents of the nearby city of Weimar are forced to visit the site on this 16th April. The commanding US general wants to confront the people with the extent of the atrocities. A surviving prisoner recalls,
Faced with the abominations which were offered to their eyes, the women screamed, some fainted, but the men too had to force themselves to keep their emotions in check.
Now no one can close their eyes to the truth.
Fred, I've completely lost my bearings. That would be madness, wouldn't it? And the horror stories about the SS, I don't know what's going on. I never thought that German men would dare to commit such atrocities.
Meanwhile, in the Rhineland, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war are forced to camp in the open for lack of suitable billets, only meagerly supplied. Having just escaped the war, thousands die of malnutrition and disease. Monday, April 23rd, 1945, still 15 days before war's end. Nuremberg. The Nazis have been celebrating their party rallies since 1929. On April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, the city is liberated. Here too, most are glad that the war is over and fear how things will go from here. Berlin has been under heavy artillery fire for 2 days. The Soviet generals do not know how many defenders to expect. By telegram, Stalin urges Marshal Zhukov to hurry, with a lie.
Due to our slow advance, the Allies are advancing on Berlin and will soon take it.
About 2.7 million people are still in Berlin, meanwhile declared a frontline city, with its own specially printed newspaper. The Panzerbeer, the combat paper for the defense of Greater Berlin, calls for perseverance.
A serious warning from the Führer. Remember, anyone who propagates or even approves measures that weaken our resistance is a traitor and is immediately to be shot or hanged.
The mood in the Reich Chancellery is one of doom. Hitler is forced to realize that hardly anyone is still able to carry out his orders. His inner circle is crumbling. The second man in the state, Hermann Göring, withdraws to Bavaria, where he is later taken prisoner. On March 23rd, he asks Berlin whether he should assume leadership of the Reich. Hitler is furious and has Göring arrested. 2 weeks later, the Americans find him. Minister of Armaments Albert Speer comes to the bunker to bid farewell. Hitler is determined to die is his impression, as if he was talking to a lifeless man. For the last time, on the afternoon of April 23rd, Hitler has himself photographed in the ruins of the Reichschancellery. He then entrenches himself in his underground bunker beneath 4 meters of concrete, watched over by his bodyguard. Propaganda Minister Goebbels, also the Gauleiter of Berlin, remains at Hitler's side. He broadcasts slogans of perseverance on the radio.
Meine Berliner Volksgenossen und Volksgenossinnen, Verteidiger Berlins, ihr kennt jetzt eure Aufgabe und ich weiß, ihr werdet sie vorbildlich erfüllen. Die Stunde eurer Bewährung ist da. Ich bleibe mit meinen Mitarbeitern selbstverständlich in Berlin. Auch meine Frau und meine Kinder sind hier und bleiben hier.
His wife Magda and their 6 children have meanwhile also moved into the bunker. A fanatical Nazi, she categorically refuses to bring her offspring to safety. Like herself, the children are not to survive the failure of her doctrine. Wednesday, April 25th, 1945, still 13 days before war's end. The village of Lawrenzkirch on the Elbe is the scene of an historic event on this day in April. An American reconnaissance patrol is crossing the river and encounters a Soviet unit. Next day, 40 kilometers downstream on the Elbe Bridge in Torgau, the first official meeting between the Soviets and the Americans has been specially organized. Both sides prepare a big celebration. Photos and film footage will go around the world. Nothing is left to chance. Photographers and camera teams are carted in, as well as a delegation of the Allies. East meets West is the name given to the spectacle. British, Americans and Soviets demonstrate unity to the world, the alliance against Hitler as a model for success. Monday, April 30th, 1945, still 8 days before war's end. Fighting still continues in a few streets in Berlin's inner city. But the soldiers of the Wehrmacht are running out of ammunition. The military reckon they can hold out for 2 days at most. In the bunker, beneath the Reichschancellery, at midnight, Hitler fulfills Eva Braun's last wish and takes her to wife. The original document. The bride almost signed with her maiden name, but notices her mistake in time. Hitler's secretary, Martin Bormann, is to take care of everything else. Later, in the late 80s, an East German camera team filmed the bunker one last time before it was sealed forever. Shortly after the end of the war, Hitler's secretary reports exactly what happened on that April 30th to American investigators.
Hitler gave me his hand and said, "Frau Junge, now it is so far, it is finished. Goodbye." He talked with a weak voice. Eva Braun embraced me and said, "Give my greetings to Munich and take my fur coat as a memory." she disappeared with Hitler in his little working room, and the door was closed.
At 3:15 p.m., the Hitler couple withdraws. No one hears when the shot is fired. Photos from the summer of 1945. Only much later does it become apparent. Hitler killed himself with a shot in the head. His wife with cyanide. The day before, the dictator dictated his political testament. He had only acted out of love and loyalty to his people, he claims, blaming Judaism for his devastating war. On the streets, people must loot in order to survive. Hundreds of soldiers still die for their Führer, who is long since dead. The war is still not over. Hitler has appointed his faithful Goebbels as Reich Chancellor, Grand Admiral Dönitz as Reich President and Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht. Karl Dönitz learns of his promotion on April 30th, but not of Hitler's death. In a telegram, he faithfully pledges,
"I will bring this war to an end, as the heroic struggle of the German people demands."
Dönitz has set up his headquarters in Holstein, Switzerland, in a barracks near Plön. There, the Grand Admiral rallies his followers and takes precautions, for he fears an attempted coup. Above all, he sees Heinrich Himmler as a danger. Because of his attempted contact with the West, the SS chief has been stripped of all office by Hitler. Himmler brings an armed bodyguard to the meeting with Dönitz in Plön on April 30th. As a precaution, Dönitz has a loaded pistol within reach.
"Let me be the second man in your state,"
the SS chief is alleged to have said. Dönitz refuses. He has no use for him. Himmler leaves without further ado. Tuesday, May 1st, 1945, still 7 days before war's end. The former concentration camp of Dachau near Munich, for 12 long years a place of torment, torture and murder. On this May 1st, US cameramen take a walk through the inferno. 2 days earlier, US troops found 32,000 prisoners and several thousand who did not survive the SS death marches. Enraged, several of the GIs shoot about 50 guards. Yet there are exceptions. Most of the offenders are routinely arrested. Former camp inmates unmask the SS thugs who were their tormentors. In Berlin, the Red Army is celebrating International Labor Day. The German positions in the government quarter have not yet capitulated, as Stalin had hoped for the holiday. There are rumors of Hitler's death, but no confirmation. Reich Chancellor Goebbels offers a truce, but the Soviets decline. The Soviets declare the red flag on the burnt-out Reichstag as the symbol of their victory. Close by, beneath the Reich Chancellery, Goebbels fears that his hiding place will soon be detected. On May 1st, 1945, he and his wife take their own lives. Before that, they murder their 6 children. A few days later, their corpses are lined up for a Soviet camera. The bodies of Josef and Magda Goebbels are burned. A German vice admiral identifies the dead. Who crushed the poison capsules into the mouths of the peacefully sleeping children is unknown to this day. Most likely, their own mother. On May 2nd, 1945, the capital surrenders. A Berlin woman writes in her diary,
"Hitler is dead. Like a phantom, the Third Reich has dissolved. With the swastikas of his Nazi flags, Herr Hitler has also been dumped on the rubbish heap.
Sunday, May 6, 1945. Still 2 days before war's end. In Flensburg-Mühlvik, the Provisional Reich government holds spectral cabinet meetings in a naval school. Among Dönitz's closest advisors are Colonel General Alfred Jodl and Albert Speer. Here, pictures after the arrest in late May 1945. Dönitz categorically rejects capitulation on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht is only to lay down its arms in the west and the north. May 6, 1945. Jodl flies to the headquarters of the Western Allies in Reims. The British and Americans insist on unconditional surrender on all fronts. In the presence of a Soviet general, Jodl finally signs. The war is to end on May 8th at 11 p.m. Central European Time. At the entrance to the Reich Chancellery, Soviet soldiers make a sensational find. They believe they have discovered Hitler's body, but it turns out to be just a soldier who resembles Hitler. On this May 6th, the mortal remains of Adolf and Eva Hitler have already disappeared from the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Their charred bodies have been dug up and removed by the Soviet Secret Service. Tuesday, May 8, 1945. The Second World War in Europe is at an end. In Flensburg, Hitler's successor, Dönitz, announces the news that many have long been awaiting.
German men and women. On May the 8th, 11 p.m., the guns will fall silent.
When Stalin learns of the surrender in the West, he is furious and demands a reprise of the ceremony in his own sphere of influence. Thus, on May 8, 1945, a delegation of the Wehrmacht travels to Berlin-Karlshorst. This time, the Soviet Union presents itself as the actual victor. Marshal Zhukov sits in the center. The British, Americans and French look like observers. Shortly before midnight, the representatives of the Wehrmacht set their seal on the surrender, unconditionally. May 8, 1945. After 2,077 days, the Second World War in Europe comes to an end. For millions, the last 100 days had been a struggle for life and death. 100 days of constant death and terror. The collapse of a world gone mad. Liberation from indescribable suffering, from privation and fanaticism, and the dawning of a new age.